When I saw my husband standing on the porch with my old leather-bound journal in his hands, my breath caught, not because I was afraid of him reading about my teenage crushes or the trivial notes I used to keep, but because of what was written in the last few pages. The pages that were never meant for his eyes. The pages where my handwriting shook, where the ink had smudged under my trembling hand that night in Sedona. I wanted to snatch it away before his eyes reached those lines, but he stepped back, his grip tightening. His eyes flicked down again, scanning word by word, his expression changing with each sentence. I could see the color draining from his face, his lips parting slightly, as though trying to breathe through something too heavy to process. He turned the page, slower now, as if bracing himself, and I knew he was getting closer to the entry that would burn everything to the ground. The one I wrote not to confess, but to purge myself of the weight I could no longer carry. And just as he reached the edge of that page, the journal slipped from his hands. Not because I pulled it, but because his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and froze. He didn't blink. His jaw clenched. I saw the muscles in his forearm tighten as he read the name of the sender. My tongue pressed against the inside of my cheek, a habit I'd had since childhood when I was fighting the urge to speak. My stomach knotted. My chest ached with the memory of everything I had done. His breathing changed, quicker, heavier, ragged. I didn't need to look at the phone to know what name had appeared on it. I had been dreading this moment for 3 months, ever since I made the choice that changed absolutely everything. Before I tell you the truth about that week, the truth I've fought to bury, let me take you back to the beginning, to the first day in Sedona, when the mistake I thought I could control began to take root in a way I never imagined. The desert air in Sedona had a way of clinging to the skin, warm even in the early hours, carrying the faint scent of juniper and dust. I stepped out of the car with my husband, squinting against the blinding stretch of red rock that seemed to rise straight from the earth. My mother's new husband was waiting at the edge of the driveway, a glass of iced tea in hand, smiling in a way that was both casual and strangely attentive. I hadn't seen him often since their wedding 6 months ago, just a few polite dinners when they visited the city, but something about seeing him against this backdrop made him seem different. More solid. More present. My husband was busy unloading the suitcases, already calculating where he could set up his laptop for work. He'd assured me this trip would be about rest, but I knew better. There was always another client call, another proposal to tweak. I told myself I didn't mind. We had been married for 28 years, long enough to settle into habits that didn't require constant closeness. Still, the small gap between us lately had started to feel less like comfort and more like absence. My mother came out from the house, all sun hats and linen, her energy lighter than I'd seen it in years. She wrapped me in a hug that smelled faintly of lavender lotion, then kissed my husband's cheek before turning to usher us inside. Her voice was bright, proud as she pointed out the cedar beams, the view from the kitchen window, the stone fireplace. But it was her husband who lingered in my periphery, moving with a deliberate calm that seemed to make the whole house slower around him. The guest room they'd prepared for us was simple, white cotton sheets, a window that framed a perfect slice of the red cliffs. My husband set his briefcase on the desk, already pulling out cables, muttering about Wi-Fi speed. I slipped off my shoes, pressing my toes into the cool rug, and wandered toward the window. Outside, the late afternoon light painted the rocks in gold and rust, the kind of color you can't photograph. Dinner was served on the back patio, my mother talking about the small farmers market in town, the hiking trails, the local gallery she loved. My husband nodded, answering when spoken to but keeping half his attention on his phone. Across from me, her husband, my stepfather, though I'd never called him that, asked quiet questions. Not intrusive, just curious. How was my work going? Had I picked up painting again? Was city life as loud as ever? His gaze was steady when I answered, the kind that made you feel the words you spoke were actually heard. After sunset, the house grew still. My mother retired early, my husband retreated to the guest room with his laptop, and I found myself restless. The desert outside called to me in a way I couldn't explain. I slipped out to the patio, the boards cool beneath my bare feet. The stars here were uncountable, sharp against the black sky. I didn't expect to see him there. He stood near the railing, hands in his pockets, looking out over the dark expanse of rock and shadow. "Hard to sleep your first night here," he said without turning. His voice was low, almost blending into the hum of the night. "I guess so," I murmured, stepping closer. "It's quieter than I'm used to." He nodded, finally glancing at me. The porch light caught the lines on his face, the kind etched from years outdoors, from weather and sun and something deeper. "It takes a while," he said. "The quiet can feel loud at first." We stood there for what might have been a minute or an hour, the silence between us not uncomfortable, but charged in a way I couldn't name. My heart wasn't racing, at least not yet, but I was aware of my own breathing, of the way the night air seemed warmer near him. I told myself it was just the desert heat. When I finally went back inside, my husband was asleep, his laptop still open beside him. I closed it, slid under the sheets, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere outside, a coyote called into the darkness, and for reasons I didn't fully understand, I felt as if something in me had shifted ever so slightly, like a door I hadn't realized was closed had just been left ajar. Would you like me to continue directly with Chapter 2 under the exact same rules? The morning light in Sedona doesn't ease its way in gently, it arrives in sharp angles through the slats of the blinds, warming the room before you're ready for it. I opened my eyes slowly, my body heavy from a restless night. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the muted tapping of my husband's keyboard. He was already awake, hunched over the desk, focused entirely on the screen in front of him. His coffee sat untouched beside him, steam long gone. I stared at his back for a long moment, waiting for him to notice I was awake. He didn't. When I finally sat up, he turned his head slightly and said, "Morning," without looking at me. I responded, more out of politeness than connection, and stepped into the bathroom. As the cold water touched my face, I felt the faintest memory of last night return, of standing on the porch, of the stars, of his voice. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People talk under the stars. People find comfort in silence. That didn't make it something more. But as I stepped out and wrapped myself in the light robe hanging near the door, I caught my reflection. My face was flushed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Not the color that comes from heat or exertion, but something deeper, like the afterglow of attention. That realization made me pause. I busied myself with making tea, acting as if the way my hands trembled slightly had nothing to do with him. Breakfast was a quiet affair. My mother chirped about hiking trails and local markets while my husband answered work emails. Her husband sat across from me again, eating slowly, occasionally glancing my way. Once, our eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but something passed between us. A recognition. I looked away first. Later that morning, my mother asked if I wanted to accompany her to a spa in town. I declined. I said I had a headache, which wasn't a lie, but not the full truth either. She offered to cancel her appointment, but I insisted. Eventually, she left with a light-hearted wave, leaving only the three of us in the house. My husband retreated to the guest room with a conference call. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to scroll through recipes on my phone, even though I wasn't reading a word. He entered without a sound, moved to the counter, poured himself a glass of water. I didn't look up, but I felt his presence. It filled the space between the cabinets and the tile. "You okay?" he asked, voice soft. I nodded. "Just tired." A long pause. Sedona takes a few days to settle into you, he said. Everything slows down. Makes it harder to pretend you're not feeling things. I turned to face him then. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't teasing. He looked at me the way people look when they're choosing whether to say something that could change everything. But he didn't. He just took a sip of water and walked away. Later that day, my husband suggested we all go on a short hike behind the house. My mother, now back and refreshed, was excited. Her husband agreed easily. I didn't want to go, but not for the reasons they would assume. Still, I laced up my shoes and followed them out. The trail wasn't difficult. It wound gently up a small incline, providing views of the valley below. My mother chatted incessantly, and my husband offered short responses, clearly distracted by some work issue. He stopped halfway to take a phone call, stepping off the trail to find reception. The three of us continued without him. My mother moved ahead, leaving me and her husband walking in near silence. A bird flapped its wings from a nearby branch, the only sound breaking the stillness. I stepped over a root and stumbled slightly. He reached out, catching my arm gently. "Careful," he murmured. And then it happened. There was no pause, no warning, no build-up that would justify it or make it easier to understand. Our eyes met again, just for a second too long. He leaned forward, and we kissed. It was brief. No words were spoken. When we stepped apart, there was only the wind, rustling the bushes around us. I felt my stomach twist. I didn't look at him again until my mother called to us from up ahead. I followed her voice, blindly, heart pounding. That evening, I couldn't eat. I pushed food around my plate while my mother told a story about a local art class she'd found. My husband barely noticed, he was still answering messages. I excused myself early, claiming I was tired. My mother kissed my cheek and told me to sleep well. As I walked down the hall, I felt a pair of eyes on my back. In the room, I closed the door and leaned against it. My breath was shallow, my hands clammy. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. What had I done? What had we done? It wasn't supposed to mean anything. It couldn't. I was married. He was my mother's husband. We were adults, capable of restraint, of boundaries. And yet, I didn't feel regret. I felt terror, yes. Confusion. Guilt. But not regret. I changed into pajamas slowly, mechanically. My husband was still out in the main room. I slipped under the sheets and turned off the light. In the darkness, my mind replayed it again, the suddenness, the electricity of it, the weight of silence after. It was a mistake. One I would not repeat. That's what I told myself. But deep down, under the shame and the fear, something inside me whispered that a line had been crossed, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The next morning began with an unsettling sense of stillness. The air felt heavier, the sunlight more intrusive. I lay in bed longer than usual, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards beyond the door and the low hum of conversation from the kitchen. The memory of what had happened on the trail clung to me, not like a dream, but like something real that refused to soften with distance. I had kissed my mother's husband. Or perhaps he had kissed me. The distinction felt pointless now. The moment had happened. And while brief, it lingered in my skin, in my thoughts, in the way I noticed every sound, every silence. By the time I emerged from the room, the kitchen table was already set. My mother, ever the enthusiastic hostess, had prepared a spread of sliced fruit, scrambled eggs, and coffee. She greeted me with a bright smile and a casual remark about the weather, as if nothing in the world had shifted. As if something unspoken hadn't just planted itself in the foundation of our family. I nodded, murmuring a greeting in return, and poured myself coffee. My hands were steady, but only because I forced them to be. Across the table, he sat calmly, spreading jam on a piece of toast. His eyes didn't meet mine, not once. That somehow made it worse. My husband entered a few minutes later, phone already in hand, half listening to the morning chatter as he checked his notifications. He looked tired, distracted. He didn't notice the tension threading through the room like a live wire. After breakfast, plans for the day began to unfold. My mother wanted to visit a local artisan fair in town and asked if I'd join her. I hesitated. I could feel him watching me now, subtly, through the corner of his eye. I agreed to go, though the last thing I wanted was to walk beneath colorful tents pretending everything was fine. As we left, I caught a glimpse of him leaning against the patio railing, arms crossed, eyes following us until we turned down the road. The fair was charming in the way small-town events often are, booths of handmade jewelry, pottery, woven baskets. My mother seemed genuinely happy, chatting with vendors, pointing out trinkets. I did my best to respond, but my mind wasn't there. Every few minutes, my thoughts circled back to him, how he'd looked when I walked into the kitchen, the weight of his silence, the memory of the way our lips had met with that strange mix of certainty and disbelief. At one booth, my mother picked up a necklace and held it up to my neck, laughing as she told me how it brought out the color in my eyes. I nodded, thanked her, and tried to smile. But I could feel the weight of guilt rising in my chest, thick and inescapable. By the time we returned to the house in the early afternoon, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with walking. My husband was nowhere to be seen, likely still working in the guest room. My mother disappeared into the back bedroom, saying something about lying down for a bit. I wandered out to the porch, needing air. He was there again, sitting in the same chair as the night before, a book open in his hands. I hesitated at the door, unsure if I should join him, unsure if I even trusted myself. But he didn't look up. He didn't speak. That somehow made it easier. I sat down in the chair farthest from his, angled slightly away. The silence stretched between us, taut and humming. I told myself I should leave, go back inside, find my husband, force normalcy back into place. But I stayed. After a long while, he spoke. "You went to the fair?" I nodded. "It was fine." "Buy anything?" I shook my head. "Nothing that felt right." A pause. He turned a page in his book, the sound louder than it should have been. "We don't need to talk about it," he said finally. My breath caught. My fingers tightened around the arm of the chair. "I know," I said. And we didn't. That night, dinner was quieter. My mother was in high spirits, recounting her afternoon dream and laughing at her own forgetfulness. My husband asked about internet speeds and whether the router could be moved closer to the guest room. He didn't look at me much. I couldn't tell if he was simply preoccupied or if he was starting to feel the shift beneath our feet. After we cleaned up, everyone retired early. I stayed behind, slowly drying the last of the dishes, watching the patterns of steam curl into the air. The silence in the kitchen was softer now, less sharp. But it still pressed in on me. When I returned to the guest room, my husband was asleep. Or pretending to be. His back was to me, his breathing even. I changed quietly, slipped under the sheets, and stared at the ceiling. My mind raced. Not just about what had happened, but about what it meant. Could something so brief carry such weight? Could something that wasn't repeated still unravel everything? And the worst part, the part one kept trying to ignore, was that I didn't know if I wanted to stop it. The thought terrified me. I rolled over, facing the wall, pressing my palms together beneath the pillow like a child hoping to sleep through a storm. But there was no storm. Just the quiet pull of a mistake not yet done pulling. And I knew, deep down, it wouldn't be the last. The morning after was the kind that offered no clear beginning, just a slow return to consciousness beneath stiff white sheets and the distant sound of footsteps on wood. I opened my eyes to a room steeped in that early golden light Sedona seemed to specialize in. The ceiling fan spun lazily, creating a rhythm that offered no comfort. My husband was gone from the room, though his phone and briefcase remained. I could smell coffee, faint and bitter, wafting through the hallway. I moved mechanically, brushing my teeth with more pressure than necessary, pulling my hair back tightly as though restraint could be re-established through routine. But nothing about the day ahead promised to be ordinary. Not after the thoughts I'd allowed the night before. Not after the kiss I hadn't confessed, nor been able to forget. In the kitchen, I found my mother already at the stove, flipping something in a pan with the ease of repetition. Her cheerfulness was as intact as ever, but I noticed the slight twitch in her shoulder, a sign she hadn't slept deeply. Her husband wasn't in sight. "Morning," she said brightly. "I thought we'd drive into town today. There's a gallery showing near the plaza. Thought you might like it." I nodded and took a mug from the shelf, filling it without speaking. The heat of the coffee seared my palm through the ceramic, grounding me in something tangible. She watched me, pausing for just a moment. "Everything all right?" I managed a small smile. "Didn't sleep well. Desert air will do that." She turned back to the stove. My husband came in a few minutes later, already dressed and buttoning his shirt. "Got pulled into a few calls this morning," he said as he kissed my cheek. "I barely registered the contact. I'll be locked away most of the day." I nodded. He didn't notice. He rarely did anymore. Not in the ways that mattered. My mother left shortly after breakfast, taking her husband's car. She gave me a long look before she walked out the door, more thoughtful than usual, but said nothing. I stood in the hallway as the car pulled away, feeling the echo of her departure settle in the floorboards. I wasn't alone in the house. He was in the garden, kneeling near the stone path, his hands deep in soil, trimming back rosemary with slow, deliberate movements. I watched him from the window for longer than I should have. His sleeves were rolled up, forearms streaked with dust, shirt clinging slightly in the rising heat. There was nothing extraordinary about what he was doing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Eventually, I opened the sliding door and stepped out. My bare feet touched the warm tiles, and he looked up as if he'd already known I was coming. "Thought you were going to the gallery," he said, brushing soil from his hands. I stayed. He stood slowly, wiping his palms on a faded cloth he'd tucked in his back pocket. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The garden buzzed with heat and bees. A hummingbird flitted near the edge of the rosemary bush before vanishing. "I shouldn't have let that happen," I said finally, the words brittle but necessary. He nodded. "I know. But we did." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, equal parts acceptance and restraint. "Yes." I glanced away, ashamed of how the honesty burned and calmed in equal measure. "It doesn't have to happen again." "I won't cross that line," he said quietly. "Unless you ask me to." The truth of that sat between us, heavy and unmoving. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned and walked back inside. I spent most of the day moving through the house like a ghost, picking up books I didn't read, folding laundry that didn't belong to me, wiping already clean counters. My husband emerged only to refill his coffee. We spoke, briefly, about nothing at all. By late afternoon, I wandered into the den. The air was cooler here, shadows deeper. A bookshelf lined the far wall, stacked with a careful mix of fiction and philosophy. I pulled down a hardcover at random. It was old, the spine cracked, a name I didn't recognize scribbled inside the cover. I settled into the corner chair and let the pages blur. But I wasn't reading. I was listening, for footsteps, for silence, for the way time stretched in a house where everyone avoided what they felt. He appeared in the doorway an hour later. He didn't enter, just leaned one shoulder against the frame. "I'm heading to the market," he said. "Need anything?" I shook my head. He watched me for a beat longer than necessary, then left. When my mother returned that evening, she was flushed from sun and excitement. She talked about the exhibit, the colors, the conversation with a sculptor who reminded her of someone from her youth. Her husband listened patiently, smiling now and then. He looked at her with familiarity, but not warmth. Dinner was more vibrant than the night before. My husband spoke a little more, my mother laughed easily, and I played the part of a woman content in the middle of a vacation with family. But every time his hand passed the wine to my mother, or he leaned slightly to hear her speak, I felt something inside me contract. Not jealousy, something worse. Envy. Not of what they had, but of what they had the power to destroy without knowing it. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, I stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked back with eyes that didn't blink. I studied the lines near my mouth, the faint crease between my brows, the tired pull of my shoulders. I had been faithful for nearly 30 years. Not just in body, but in mind, in heart, in compromise. I had silenced longing for the sake of peace, pushed aside curiosity for predictability. And now, all it had taken was a few words, a gaze held too long, a single moment under an open sky, and I was someone else. Or maybe not someone else. Maybe just someone I hadn't allowed myself to be. That night I lay beside my husband, listening to the sound of his breathing, steady and oblivious. I didn't touch him. He didn't reach for me. And still, beneath the weight of guilt, something began to form, a quiet, terrifying question. If a single line had been crossed once, what was stopping it from being crossed again? The day started like the others, sunlight washing through the windows in broad strokes, casting long rectangles across the tile floors. I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence inside the guest room too dense to ignore. My husband had already left for a morning hike with a few locals he'd met at the coffee shop. He'd invited me to join the night before, out of habit more than desire, and I'd declined with a tired smile that neither of us believed. My mother was in town for a hair appointment. She'd mentioned it during dinner, brushing a hand over her roots with an exaggerated sigh and a laugh. She was the only one who still laughed easily. She'd taken her husband's car again. I didn't ask why. By mid-morning, I was alone in the house. The kind of alone that doesn't just mean empty rooms, but the kind that leaves no space to hide. I wandered from room to room, fingers tracing picture frames, folded blankets, the worn edges of books. My breath seemed to echo. The hallway to the back of the house was cooler, lined with framed watercolors of desert landscapes. I paused outside the study door. It was slightly ajar. He was inside, sitting at the desk with his back to me, flipping through a leather-bound notebook. Not his own. My mother's. Her handwriting, her careful loops. I didn't want to know what it said, but I couldn't look away. He heard me before I spoke. "You shouldn't be in here," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He closed the book gently and turned around. I was looking for a pen. I stepped inside, even though I shouldn't have. "Did you find one?" He held it up. A simple black pen. Nothing special. But the silence around it carried weight. I crossed my arms, trying to center myself. "You know this can't keep happening." He nodded. "I'm not the one pushing it." That stung more than it should have. I turned to leave, but he stepped around the desk and stopped a few feet from me. "Do you want it to stop?" I didn't answer. Not right away. The question sank deep, found every hollow space inside me. "We po," I said finally, the words stiff and deliberate. It was a mistake. Was it? The way he said it, level, certain, made me feel like he already knew the answer. I hated that he wasn't the one falling apart. That it was me, every day, more unraveled than the last. I stepped back. "I can't talk to you like this." He didn't follow. He let me go. I spent the next hour outside on the far edge of the property, where the gravel path curved behind a ridge of boulders and the house was mostly out of view. The sky stretched endlessly above me, the same hue as the glaze on my mother's favorite teacup. I stood there for a long time, shoes sinking into the dust, unsure if I wanted to cry or scream. When I returned, the house was still quiet. I made lunch mechanically, barely tasted the food. The clink of fork against plate was the only sound in the kitchen. He didn't reappear until just before sunset. My mother still hadn't come back. Neither had my husband. I was in the living room when he walked in, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. He offered me one without a word. I took it, because it was easier than refusing. We sat across from each other, not touching, not talking. The silence wasn't charged this time. It was dull, heavy. The kind that comes after something breaks. But it didn't last. He shifted in his chair, set his glass down. "Do you remember what you said about feeling invisible?" I looked at him, wary. "Yes. I see you," he said. Just that. No flourish. No seduction. Just certainty. The room held its breath. We didn't move. We didn't speak. Then, like something outside of both of us, something inevitable, we po. No longer full of tension or confusion. Just quiet clarity. We pulled apart slowly, and I stood before anything else could happen. "I have to go," I said. "Then go." I walked back to the guest room with my pulse in my throat. I packed a small bag. I didn't know why, or where I thought I was going, but the act of packing felt like action. Like control. When my mother returned an hour later, the house filled with the scent of her perfume and the noise of her chatter. I met her in the kitchen, smiled when she asked how my day was, nodded when she mentioned needing help with dinner. But my hands shook when I chopped the onions. I blamed it on the knife. My husband returned last, sunburned and distracted, talking about a trail he wanted to show me tomorrow. I agreed before I could think. That night, as we all sat around the dinner table, I felt the heat of 2 pairs of eyes on me, the one that hadn't noticed a thing, and the one that had seen too much. I excused myself early, feigning fatigue. In the mirror, I studied my face again. My skin looked thinner somehow, as if everything beneath it had risen closer to the surface. I couldn't tell if I was becoming more myself, or less. I lay awake for hours that night, counting ceiling tiles, listening for footsteps. But none came. Only silence. And the knowledge that I would never be the same. The next morning arrived with no ceremony. Just the usual light pressing its way through the thin curtains, the distant hum of the ceiling fan, and the hollow rhythm of someone moving through the kitchen down the hall. I stayed in bed longer than usual, the sheets twisted around me from a night of shallow sleep and restless thoughts. My husband's side of the bed was already cold. He'd gone out early, maybe for a walk, maybe for space neither of us had the courage to admit we needed. When I finally got up and stepped into the bathroom, I moved slowly, avoiding my own reflection in the mirror. Something in me had begun to shift, not dramatically, not with fire or thunder, but like a slow unraveling of threads I hadn't noticed were loose. I was still me. But there was a faint sense of being on the verge of something, and it made everything quieter, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next. By the time I reached the kitchen, my mother and her husband were already at the table. She was animated, talking about a community garden project she'd just read about. He listened, nodding occasionally, sipping from a mug of coffee. When I entered, their conversation paused briefly. He looked up at me, eyes lingering just a second longer than they should have, and then returned to his cup. "Morning," my mother chirped. "You're up late today." "Didn't sleep well," I said, pouring myself a cup. "You need to start taking melatonin," she advised, as if that could fix what had unraveled inside me. I sat with them, answered her questions about plans for the day, but I wasn't really there. My mind moved through other rooms, other glances, moments still heavy with unspoken weight. My husband returned a few minutes later, winded from a run. He kissed the top of my head, his lips cool from the air outside. It felt like habit, not affection. The day passed in pieces. My mother asked if I wanted to help her organize old photo albums in the den. I agreed. Anything to fill the space, to keep my hands busy. We spent nearly 2 hours sifting through decades of memories, vacations, holidays, birthdays. In one album, tucked between Christmas photos and a summer trip to the lake, was a picture of her husband, taken long before they'd married. He stood with a group of people I didn't recognize, younger, more relaxed. She tapped the photo and smiled. That was from his Arizona years. Long before me. He never talks about that time much. I stared at the image, not sure why it unsettled me. Maybe it was the reminder that he'd had a life before this, before us. That I knew so little about it. Later, when she left the room to take a call, I flipped back to that photo again. The woman standing near him had her arm lightly against his. The pose was casual. Familiar. I closed the album quietly. Dinner was planned for the patio. My mother insisted on grilling vegetables, and my husband opened a bottle of wine. Everyone seemed lighter, more engaged, but for me, the ease felt forced. I couldn't keep track of the conversation. I only heard rhythms, her laughter, his voice, the clink of cutlery. After we ate, the sun dipped low over the canyon edge, casting everything in a soft amber haze. My mother asked my husband to help her with a lighting fixture inside. They disappeared, chatting as they walked away. That left us alone again. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood beside the railing, looking out at the horizon. I sat in one of the wooden chairs, arms folded across my chest. "I saw the picture," I said. He turned slowly. "Which one?" "The one with the woman. Arizona. You looked happy." He didn't deny it. I was. "That was a long time ago." "Why don't you talk about it?" "Because some things are better left where they belong." I looked away. The canyon was turning purple now, the edges softening in shadow. "And where do we belong?" I asked, barely above a whisper. There was a pause, the kind that drags seconds into hours. "I don't know," he said. "But we can't stay in this." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say something sharp, something definitive. But nothing came. Inside, laughter erupted, my mother and my husband over some trivial problem with a switch or a bulb. The sound cut through me. "I can't breathe in this house anymore," I said. "Then leave," he said quietly. "Or stay. But decide." I stood, not knowing what I was about to do until I was already walking. Past him, past the kitchen, into the hallway. I didn't stop until I reached the guest room and closed the door behind me. I sat on the bed for a long time. Not crying. Not shaking. Just waiting for something to shift. Eventually, my husband came in. He said something about the stars being bright tonight, if I wanted to take a walk. I nodded, told him I was tired. He didn't push. When he fell asleep beside me, I turned onto my side, watching the outline of the window against the wall. I thought about the photo. About the way he'd said her name without saying it. There were so many things I wanted to ask. So many things I wasn't ready to know. But one thing was clear now, whatever came next, I couldn't keep living in the in-between. Something had to break. And soon, it would. The house was quiet in that strange way only vacation homes can be, too still, too clean, too detached from routine to feel real. The early morning light crept across the floorboards of the guest room, and I sat at the edge of the bed, fully dressed, waiting. My suitcase stood half-zipped beside me, though I had no plans to leave. Packing it had been more of a ritual than a decision, something to remind myself that leaving was always an option, even if I never took it. My husband had gone into town early again, claiming he needed to find a stronger signal for a conference call. I hadn't asked questions. We had reached a point where curiosity felt more dangerous than apathy. My mother had a doctor's appointment scheduled, followed by lunch with a friend she hadn't seen in years. She'd left a note by the coffee pot, as if that would ease the strangeness of her absence. And just like that, we were alone again. He was in the sunroom when I found him, seated on the low bench by the open windows, a worn paperback in his hands, his glasses resting halfway down his nose. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. He looked up, marked the page, and set the book aside. "No one's home," I said. My voice didn't waver, but it felt like it should have. He nodded. "I know." Neither of us moved. The silence between us felt different now, less like resistance, more like permission. I sat beside him, close but not touching. The window beside us framed the vast red cliffs in the distance, their edges glowing faintly with the rising sun. I turned to him. He met my gaze without hesitation. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in glances, in hesitation, in the space we continued to allow ourselves. We spent the night together. I won't describe it. Not out of shame, but because there are things words shouldn't soften. It wasn't impulsive, nor dramatic. It was quiet, certain, like the closing of a circle that had been drawing itself since the first evening on the porch. When I woke, the room was steeped in half-light. The air felt different, as if even the walls knew what had changed. He was already up, moving quietly around the kitchen. I didn't join him right away. I sat at the edge of the bed, my fingers curled tightly around the edge of the mattress. My thoughts weren't loud. They were still. Not calm, still. The kind of stillness that follows a storm you didn't prepare for. Eventually, I walked down the hall. My feet were bare, the floor cold beneath them. He looked up when I entered the kitchen. There was no awkwardness in his face, no hesitation. Just quiet understanding. I poured a cup of coffee. We didn't speak. He didn't reach for me. And that made it harder. My mother returned mid-morning, earlier than expected. Her presence was immediate, keys clattering on the counter, the sound of grocery bags, her voice calling out into the house. I flinched, instinctively stepping away from where I'd been leaning near him. She walked in with a smile and a bag of fresh peaches, her eyes bright. She didn't notice the way my hand trembled slightly when I took one. The rest of the day blurred. My husband returned in the afternoon, distracted and irritable. My mother prepared a simple lunch, her energy cheerful but unfocused. Her husband barely spoke. I stayed quiet, answering when spoken to, careful not to meet either of their eyes for too long. That night, dinner was short. My husband excused himself early, claiming exhaustion. My mother followed a few minutes later, already making plans for a morning yoga class. I lingered in the kitchen, rinsing dishes that didn't need rinsing. He stood across from me, drying a plate with slow movements. You should sleep, I said. So should you, he answered. I didn't move. Neither did he. The silence was different now, heavier, not with guilt, but with inevitability. I don't know what happens next, I admitted. I don't either, he said. But it's already started. I left the kitchen. Walked back to the guest room. My suitcase was still there, half-zipped, untouched. I considered finishing it. I considered hiding it. But instead, I sat on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The room was dim, lit only by the spill of moonlight through the thin curtain. I tried to count my breaths, to name what I was feeling, remorse, relief, fear, but nothing settled. He hadn't made a move after that morning. Hadn't touched me. Hadn't even looked at me the way he had before. And yet, everything between us now carried weight. In the stillness, I thought of my daughter. I hadn't spoken to her in over a week. She'd sent a message before we left, something light-hearted about summer plans. I hadn't responded. What would she say if she knew? What would she see if she looked at me now? Not the woman who raised her, surely. Not the wife her father had once loved. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs, trying to ground myself in something, touch, pressure, breath. But nothing anchored me. This wasn't the end. I knew that now. It wasn't a one-time mistake to be buried beneath apologies and long drives home. It was something else. Something that had begun quietly, almost imperceptibly, and now moved through me like a fault line waiting to split. I lay down, closed my eyes, and tried to remember what my life had felt like before all this began. But I couldn't. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. The morning after didn't feel like a morning at all. It felt like an aftermath. There was no soft light, no quiet comfort. Just an awareness something had shifted, and there would be no unshifting it. I lay still beneath the sheets, my eyes open long before the sky turned pale. Every sound in the house became exaggerated, the creak of pipes, the low groan of wood expanding, the occasional sigh of wind through the open window. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to begin the day, because I knew it would be different, whether I acknowledged it or not. But staying still wasn't a solution either. Eventually, I rose, dressed in silence, and left the room. In the kitchen, my mother was already awake. She stood at the sink, rinsing berries in a colander, humming something under her breath. She didn't look up when I entered, just said, "Coffee's fresh." I poured myself a cup, the handle warm against my fingers. My heart beat too quickly. Every motion felt watched, even if her back was turned. I wondered, absurdly, if she knew, if mothers somehow felt betrayal in their bones. "Did you sleep all right?" she asked, finally turning to me. "Well enough," I said. She studied me briefly, her head tilting just slightly, the way she used to when I was a teenager coming home too late. Then she smiled and returned to the berries. "I thought we could all go into town today. There's a new exhibit at the gallery, and I've been meaning to visit the antique shop near the plaza." "That sounds nice." "Good. I'll tell him." She meant her husband. The man I had spent the night with. I nodded, said nothing, and forced myself to sip the coffee, though it tasted bitter and metallic. The morning unfolded like a performance. My husband joined us, distracted but pleasant, asking about directions and gallery hours. He offered to drive. My mother's husband stayed silent longer than usual, answering only when prompted, his movements careful and measured. I watched the way she touched his shoulder as she passed behind him, the way he smiled when she made a joke about parking meters. It all looked so normal. Too normal. I wondered how many other couples lived in these performances, how many secrets stayed buried behind smiles and schedules. The drive to town was uneventful. I sat in the back seat, beside my mother, while the two men spoke quietly in the front. The sun was strong, casting long shadows across the dusty road. My mother chatted cheerfully, occasionally pointing out landmarks as if we hadn't already seen them a dozen times. At the gallery, I drifted away from the group almost immediately. The space was bright and open, the white walls adorned with landscapes and portraits. I stood in front of one, a desert canyon rendered in thick oil strokes, for longer than necessary. He found me there. Not close enough to draw attention, just near enough to speak without raising his voice. "Are you okay?" "No," I said. "Are you?" "No." We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. After the gallery, my mother suggested lunch at a small cafe nearby. We ate outside, under the shade of a large cottonwood tree. The conversation was light, the food unremarkable. I picked at a salad I didn't want. My husband told a story about a colleague's retirement. My mother laughed, nodded, asked follow-up questions. But I saw it then, the moment she noticed. She reached for her glass of water and paused. Her gaze lingered, just for a second, too long between me and him. Her eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with something quieter. A kind of knowing. She didn't say anything. Just sipped her water and turned back to my husband, asking him something about the drive. We returned to the house mid-afternoon. Everyone scattered, my husband to check emails, my mother to lie down just for a moment, and him to the porch with a book. I stood in the hallway, frozen. Then I followed her. She lay on the bed, eyes closed, one arm draped across her forehead. I stepped into the room and waited until she looked at me. "I think I need to leave," I said. She blinked. "You mean go home early?" "Yes." She sat up slowly, her expression unreadable. "Is something wrong?" I don't feel like myself." A pause. "You don't seem like yourself," she said quietly. "Not lately." I opened my mouth to speak but found I didn't have the words. Not ones I could say aloud. She looked at me for a long time, then nodded. "Do what you need to do." That evening, no one mentioned my departure. I packed in silence, methodically folding each item, avoiding the mirror. My husband glanced over briefly but didn't ask questions. I told him I'd take the train in the morning, that I needed some time alone. He accepted this too easily. At dinner, my mother said she would drive me to the station. Her husband said he'd come along. I looked at him then, really looked. He held my gaze for the first time that day, and I saw it. Regret. Not for what had happened, but for what would be left behind. That night, I lay awake in the guest room one last time, listening to the wind press against the windows. I thought of all the things I hadn't said. All the things I still couldn't say. In the stillness, I realized something I hadn't before: not all mistakes come from weakness. Some come from hunger. From absence. From the quiet, desperate need to feel something real. And once you've felt it, no matter how wrong, you can't unfeel it. The train would take me away from Sedona, but not from what I had done. That would follow. It always does. The train station was smaller than I expected. A single platform stretched out beneath a faded awning, the metal bench slick with the morning's condensation. My mother parked close to the entrance, her hands resting on the wheel longer than necessary before she finally turned off the engine. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The silence between us felt heavier than any words we could try to fill it with. I glanced over at her. She didn't look angry. Not even disappointed. Just tired. Her features were calm, but I could tell she had spent the night thinking. Perhaps not about the specifics, but enough. Enough to understand. She finally exhaled and reached for her purse. I'll walk you in. We moved slowly through the lot and across the platform, my bag rolling behind me with a soft rattle on the concrete. The train wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. A breeze stirred the edges of the departure schedule taped to the wall. I stood with my hands wrapped around the handle of my luggage, unsure of what to say. I'm not going to ask you to explain, my mother said, her voice measured. You don't owe me that. Not now. I looked at her, startled. She was staring straight ahead, watching a distant pickup truck ease into the lot. Her posture was still, almost serene. But I do want you to understand something, she continued. Whatever happened, whatever this was, it didn't start in Sedona. It didn't even start this year. Sometimes, when people don't feel seen for long enough, they reach for the nearest light, even if it burns. Her words landed somewhere deep in my chest. I tried to find a response, but nothing came that didn't sound hollow. She turned to me then, her expression steady. I'm not excusing it. I'm not condoning it. I'm just saying. I'm not blind. The sound of a horn in the distance signaled the train's approach. I felt a sharp, sudden panic rise in my throat, something between guilt and the fear of leaving unfinished truths behind. I didn't mean for it to happen, I said quietly. I know. She looked at me with something close to sadness. But you let it. The train slowed as it pulled into the station, its brakes hissing, a few passengers waiting near the far end of the platform. My mother stepped back. I reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. She didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back. Call me when you get in, she said. I will. She watched me board, her figure shrinking in the window as the train began to move. I didn't cry. I stared at the fields blurring past and felt the dull thud of something inside me that refused to settle. The ride home was long. Too long for someone who wanted to disappear into the blur of movement. Every stop, every shift in scenery reminded me I was coming back to a life I had fractured. My husband was already at work when I arrived. The apartment smelled stale, as if time had stopped in my absence. I unpacked slowly, leaving most of my clothes in the suitcase, unsure if they belonged back in the drawers. I made coffee, opened the windows, tried to remember what my routine used to be. The city noise felt louder now, less like background and more like accusation. That evening, he came home tired. He kissed my cheek out of habit, loosened his tie, poured himself a drink. I asked about his day. He answered in vague terms. We didn't talk about Sedona. We didn't talk about anything. But I knew he could feel it. The distance. The weight. We moved around each other like ghosts for the next several days. I went back to work, buried myself in emails and deadlines, meetings and niceties. I smiled when I needed to. I nodded through conversations. But underneath it all, I was listening for the sound of something cracking further, or maybe healing. One night, I came home late. He was already in bed, reading. He looked up when I entered, marked his page. You've been quiet, he said. So have you. A pause. Then, did something happen there? I froze. My bag still slung over my shoulder, keys in my hand. I could lie. Say no. Pretend. We were good at pretending. But my body betrayed me. My hesitation said everything. He looked at me, eyes dull. I thought so. I'm sorry, I said. It was the only honest thing I could manage. He nodded. Was it serious? No, I sat on the edge of the bed. But it was real. He didn't ask for details. He didn't raise his voice. He just closed the book, placed it on the nightstand, and turned off the light. I lay awake beside him, eyes open in the dark. I didn't expect forgiveness. I didn't even expect anger. But the emptiness scared me more than either. Weeks passed. We didn't speak of it again. He buried himself in work. I kept moving, one foot in front of the other. Then one day, a letter arrived. From my mother. No return address. Just my name in her handwriting. Inside was a single sentence. Some things break quietly. No greeting. No signature. No judgment. I read it 3 times. Folded it carefully. Placed it in my drawer. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the lights had been turned off, the city glowing through the windows. I wasn't angry. Not at him. Not at her. Not even at myself. But I was tired of silence. And I wasn't sure this marriage could survive it. The apartment was quieter than ever. Not the comfortable kind of quiet that settles in after a long day, but a hollowness that hung in the air like dust, impossible to ignore. The kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from absence, of effort, of presence, of whatever it was that used to fill the space between 2 people. I sat at the dining table, the same one we'd eaten thousands of meals at, now littered with unopened mail, unread magazines, and a coffee cup that had cooled hours ago. My husband had taken to working later at the office, returning well past dinner and retreating into bed without speaking. We didn't argue. We didn't confront. We existed beside each other like shadows on opposite walls. The letter from my mother was still in the drawer. I hadn't replied. I'd read it more times than I could count, those 4 words digging into me slowly, like water carving stone. Some things break quietly. I thought about breaking, what it meant to come undone. It hadn't been loud. There had been no slammed doors, no screamed accusations. Just a slow erosion, moment by moment, until the foundation cracked beneath its own weight. I had made my choice, or maybe I hadn't. Maybe choices are just reactions slowed down long enough to resemble decisions. I didn't regret Sedona. Not the place. Not the moment. Not even the aftermath. But I regretted what I hadn't done afterward, how I'd returned to the same rhythms, pretending not to notice how little they meant now. My phone buzzed against the table, its screen lighting with a notification. A name I hadn't seen since the train station. His name. The message was short. Asterisk, I'm selling the house. Thought you should know, asterisk. No greeting. No questions. Just finality. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That night, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, studying the lines that time had etched into my skin. I traced one near my mouth with a fingertip, remembering laughter that felt years away. The woman in the reflection wasn't unfamiliar, but she wasn't entirely known either. I opened the closet and pulled out an old suitcase. The same one I had packed and unpacked so many times. This time I didn't hesitate. I folded my clothes carefully, not because I was leaving, but because I needed to feel what it meant to choose myself. I didn't know where I would go. I didn't even know if I would leave. But the act of preparing gave me breath again. When he came home that night, he paused in the doorway. He looked at the suitcase, then at me. You're going somewhere? I don't know yet. He nodded slowly. Is this about what happened? No, I said. It's about everything that didn't. We stood in the quiet. The hum of the refrigerator behind us filled the space. I'm tired, he said. I know. I don't hate you. I don't hate you either. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees. I joined him. Not touching. Just near. I think we stopped seeing each other a long time ago, I said. Yeah. His voice cracked just slightly. I think we did. We didn't make promises. We didn't talk about fixing it. There was no sudden clarity, no dramatic turn. Just two people who had loved each other once, who now understood that love wasn't always enough. That weekend, I went away. Just for a few days. A rented cabin by the coast, salt in the air, gulls crying over distant rocks. I brought a notebook with me. I hadn't written in years. I sat by the window and wrote down everything. Not for him. Not for her. Not even for me. Just to see it in ink. To hold it outside of my body for a while. I wrote about Sedona. About the way the light changed in the canyon as the day wore on. About his voice, the stillness, the kiss, the quiet night. About the silence that followed. And then I wrote about coming home. About the emptiness, the effort, the truth. I cried once. Not because I was heartbroken, but because I had finally allowed myself to feel the weight of everything I'd carried for so long. When I returned to the city, the apartment was still there, unchanged. My husband had left me a note on the table. Take your time, that was all it said. I unpacked. I put my notebook on the shelf. I opened the windows and let the air move through the rooms. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to stillness. Not silence. Not emptiness. Just a space where something new might grow. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't need to. Some things break quietly. But some things begin that way, too.